Smoke drifts across a frozen forest in eastern Poland. The year is 1944. Beneath the silence, soldiers move through the trees, their breath turning white against the cold. In a nearby village, a single radio crackles to life, its signal faint, forbidden, carrying a voice the occupiers were never meant to hear. Decades later, that same signal will resurface on an old Soviet reel found in a warehouse long forgotten by time. What it reveals is a story of resistance, betrayal, and the cost of survival when the world itself is at war. Chapter 1: Shadows Before the Storm. Europe in the late 1930s was a continent holding its breath. The memories of the Great War still lingered like ghosts. Empty chairs at dinner tables, crippled veterans limping through the streets, and nations scarred by debt and pride. Yet across those same cities, life tried to rebuild itself. Children laughed in Berlin courtyards, farmers sowed wheat under the Polish sun, and in cafes from Paris to Krakow, people argued over politics as if words could stop what was coming. But under the surface, a different current moved. In Germany, banners of red and black fluttered from rooftops, the swastika spreading like a shadow across every school and office. Adolf Hitler's speeches had shifted from revival to conquest, his voice rising through loudspeakers that echoed in every town square. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. One people, one empire, one leader. For some, it was the sound of strength returning. For others, it was the drumbeat of something far darker. To the east, Joseph Stalin ruled the Soviet Union through silence and fear. Entire villages vanished under his purges. Trainloads of prisoners disappeared into the frostbitten wastes of Siberia. The Red Army drilled relentlessly, yet even its officers looked over their shoulders, unsure who might denounce them next. And between these two powers, Nazi Germany and the USSR, lay Poland, proud, rebuilt, and dangerously exposed. Warsaw in 1938 was a city of contradictions. Streetcars rattled over cobblestones while foreign diplomats gathered in grand halls, speaking in cautious tones about peace. Yet in the markets, rumors ran wild. German troops were massing near the border. Soviet spies were seen in the countryside. No one wanted to believe war would come again, but everyone felt it in their bones. Ordinary people went about their lives with a quiet defiance. Factory workers carried on their shifts. Students still filled classrooms. Mothers hung laundry under skies already filled with military patrols. The newspapers printed assurances from London and Paris, promises that any act of aggression would be met with strength. But in private, even those governments hesitated. Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, returned from Munich holding a piece of paper that declared "Peace for our time." He smiled for the cameras. Behind him, advisors whispered that the paper might as well have been blank. By spring of 1939, the storm could no longer be ignored. German forces had marched into Czechoslovakia without resistance. Italy invaded Albania, and Soviet diplomats began sending coded messages to Berlin, tentative signals of cooperation cloaked in deniability. The world stood on a knife's edge. Still, in the Polish countryside, the days began with the same rhythm. Roosters crowed. Bells rang from church towers. Farmers ploughed their fields under a sky that betrayed nothing. But on the western horizon, clouds gathered, low, grey and heavy with something more than rain. On August 23, 1939, the news broke that would change everything. Germany and the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact. Publicly, it promised peace between the two powers. Secretly, it contained a map, a hidden clause dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland was to be carved in half. The agreement was known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named for the two foreign ministers who signed it with forced smiles and trembling hands. Within a week, German armor rolled across the Polish border. The Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, had begun. Sirens wailed in Warsaw. Families fled east, carrying what they could on horse carts and bicycles. The Luftwaffe bombed open roads crowded with refugees. And in the chaos, Polish soldiers fought with desperation, using outdated rifles and courage in place of reinforcements that would never come. In London, France and Washington, leaders spoke words of condemnation. They declared war on Germany, but for weeks, they did little else. By the time they acted, it was already too late. Poland's fate was sealed not by invasion alone, but by the silence of allies who hesitated. And then, as if one knife were not enough, a second cut came from the east. On September 17th, Soviet troops crossed Poland's border. Stalin's army, dressed in green uniforms and carrying red flags, entered towns already shattered by German bombs. There was no declaration, no warning, only orders: occupy, divide, control. By the month's end, the map of Europe had changed again. Poland was gone, swallowed by two powers who had sworn to destroy one another, yet found common ground in conquest. Its government fled into exile. Its people were left behind, to live beneath occupation, to resist in silence, or to vanish into prisons and camps whose names would later define the century. And somewhere in that silence, in a forest on the edge of nowhere, a small group of Polish partisans began to organize. Their weapons were few, their hope fragile, but they carried something more powerful than either army had expected: a will to fight, and a belief that the truth of what was happening would one day be heard. That truth would take decades to surface, buried in sealed archives, hidden under false reports, recorded in whispers on forbidden radios. But even now, before the first shot of the Great War has been fired, the first signals of resistance are already in the air, faint, defiant, and waiting to be heard. Chapter 2: The Descent into War. The fall of 1939 shattered Europe's illusion of peace. What had begun as a lightning strike against Poland now spread like fire through the continent. One by one, borders turned into front lines, and in every capital, leaders faced the same question: how far they were willing to go and how much they were willing to lose. In Berlin, the mood was triumphant. Nazi propaganda filled the airwaves, promising a new era of German dominance. Streets erupted with parades, and the swastika banners glowed red against torchlight processions. But behind those celebrations, the Reich was already planning its next move. Hitler's generals gathered in the Reich Chancellery, studying maps by lamplight. Their eyes traced the western border: France, Belgium, the Netherlands, each marked with coloured pins. Operation Fall Gelb, the plan to crush Western Europe before Britain could react. Meanwhile, in London, the atmosphere was heavy with unease. Prime Minister Chamberlain, once so confident in diplomacy, now found himself facing a war he had hoped to avoid. His voice trembled as he spoke to Parliament. "It is evil things that we shall be fighting against: brute force, bad faith, injustice, oppression, and persecution." Yet even as he declared war, British soldiers waited idly along the Maginot Line, exchanging tea and cigarettes instead of bullets. Historians would later call it the phony war, but for those in Poland and Scandinavia, there was nothing false about it. The fighting never stopped. In the Soviet Union, Stalin moved swiftly to secure his share of the deal. Soviet forces annexed eastern Poland, then turned north toward the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, absorbing them under the pretext of protection. Families were awakened in the night, their doors kicked open by Red Army troops. Entire villages were loaded onto cattle cars and sent east into the unknown. Those who resisted disappeared. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, filled prisons faster than they could build them. As winter deepened, the war reached Finland. The Winter War, they called it. Soviet tanks rolled into the frozen forests, expecting a swift victory. Instead, they met fierce Finnish resistance. Small units moving silently through the snow, wearing white camouflage and striking like ghosts. The world watched in awe as Finland, outnumbered and outgunned, held the line for months. Stalin's pride suffered, but his army learned. And when the snow melted, the lessons of Finland would shape the brutality to come. In Germany, dissent was impossible. The Gestapo's reach extended into every apartment block, every factory, every whisper. Diaries from ordinary Germans speak of fear disguised as loyalty. "We do not speak," one woman wrote in 1940. "We nod, we smile, we pretend we believe." Yet even as the regime tightened its grip, the machinery of war demanded more. More steel, more labor, more lives. Factories ran day and night, their smoke blending with the darkness that seemed to settle over all of Europe. Spring 1940 brought the blitzkrieg westward. German troops stormed through Denmark and Norway in days, then turned on France. The speed was unlike anything the world had seen. Tanks surged through the Ardennes, bypassing the heavily fortified Maginot Line. French generals, still fighting the last war, watched in disbelief as their defenses became irrelevant. Cities fell one after another: Amsterdam, Brussels, Paris. The French government fled south. Marshal Pétain surrendered. The map of Europe changed again, faster than anyone could comprehend, and Britain stood alone. In the summer of 1940, as German bombers crossed the English Channel, the sky itself became a battlefield. The Battle of Britain began not with infantry or tanks, but with engines and wings. Londoners learned to recognize the sound of incoming raids, the low hum that built into a roar, the whistle of falling bombs. Each night, they crowded into subway tunnels, clutching children and gas masks, listening to the city burn above them. Yet through it all, they endured. "We shall never surrender!" Churchill's voice thundered across the radio waves. It wasn't just a speech, it was a vow. Far to the east, however, Stalin watched and waited. He had no intention of joining the fight yet. His factories built weapons in secret. His scientists developed engines and artillery, all while German trains carried him shipments of oil and steel. The world saw a fragile peace between two predators, each pretending to trust the other. But in the darkness of both regimes, plans were being drawn for an even greater betrayal. In occupied Poland, resistance movements began to take shape. Underground newspapers circulated by candlelight. Saboteurs cut railway lines and smuggled intelligence to Britain. The Polish Home Army grew in secret, connected by coded messages and hidden radios. The Gestapo hunted them relentlessly, but still they transmitted. One operator, a young woman named Danuta, kept a diary beside her transmitter. "They are afraid of what we know," she wrote. "That's why we must keep speaking." Her words would never be published. Her unit was captured in 1943. But her transmissions reached London, where they helped reveal early signs of mass deportations in the East. By 1941, the fragile alliance between Hitler and Stalin collapsed. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, began on June 22nd. The largest military operation in human history. 3 million German soldiers crossed the border at dawn. Planes screamed overhead. Villages burned within hours. Stalin, caught off guard despite countless warnings, fell into silence for days. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost broken. "Comrades, our cause is just. The enemy will be defeated." But the Red Army was in retreat, and the cost would be unimaginable. The war had now consumed an entire continent. From the beaches of Normandy to the steppes of Ukraine, from London's blackout nights to the ashes of Warsaw, no one remained untouched. Ideology had turned to blood, and diplomacy to ruin. Ordinary men and women, farmers, clerks, teachers, soldiers, were trapped in forces far beyond their control. And in that chaos, hidden beneath the thunder of war, intelligence networks began to weave their silent webs. Messages in invisible ink, photographs smuggled inside loaves of bread, names written in code, erased by acid if discovered. The real battle for the future wasn't only fought with guns, it was fought in shadows, in whispers, and in the unbroken will of those who refused to stop believing the truth mattered. The descent into war was complete, yet for millions the real struggle, the one for humanity itself, was only beginning. Chapter 3: Fire in the East. The morning of June 22, 1941, began like any other across the Western Soviet frontier. Farmers rose before dawn. Children fetched water from wells. Then, at 3:15 a.m., the sky erupted. The first artillery shells screamed across the border, and the largest invasion in history began. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's gamble to destroy the Soviet Union before winter came. 3 million Axis soldiers poured across 1,000 miles of front, from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The earth itself seemed to shatter under their advance. Witnesses later described the ground shaking as columns of tanks thundered eastward. German panzers tore through Belarusian fields, churning up clouds of dust that hung in the summer air like smoke. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. Soviet aircraft barely got off the ground before being obliterated. Entire Soviet divisions vanished within days. In the first week alone, nearly 500,000 Red Army soldiers were killed or captured. Civilians fled in chaos. Carts, bicycles, anything with wheels, clogging roads already lined with the dead. German radio called it a crusade against Bolshevism, but those who marched east knew it was something else entirely. A war of annihilation. Orders from the high command were explicit. No pity, no prisoners. Behind the front lines followed the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units whose task was to cleanse occupied areas of political enemies, partisans and Jews. Villages burned, trenches filled, rivers ran black with ash, and the world, for now, did not see. In the forests of eastern Poland and western Ukraine, the war became something different. A struggle fought in silence and shadows. Polish resistance units, cut off from any formal command, began gathering intelligence on German movements. They hid transmitters in barns, coded their messages, and risked execution with every word they sent. One of those hidden signals, faint but persistent, came from the WWII forest. It was intercepted years later by Soviet monitors. Its frequency marked unidentified civilian source. The operators would never be found, but fragments of their transmission survived. Pontau. They are rounding up families near Grodno. Trains moving east? By late summer, the German advance seemed unstoppable. Smolensk fell, then Kiev. The Red Army was reeling, yet Stalin refused to retreat. He ordered not one step back, a command that condemned millions but also slowed the German tide. Soviet soldiers fought with bayonets when their rifles jammed, with rocks when ammunition ran out. They dug trenches with their bare hands, often in frozen soil. One survivor of the defense of Moscow recalled, "We stopped being human. We became earth and ice. As autumn came, the weather turned. The roads that had carried German tanks became rivers of mud. Supply lines stretched too thin. Vehicles bogged down. Soldiers froze in their tracks. Still, the German commanders pressed forward, convinced victory was near. They could see the spires of Moscow through their binoculars. Hitler announced to his generals, 'We have only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will collapse.' But he underestimated the Russian winter and the will of its people. Inside Moscow, the air was thick with smoke and fear. Factories worked around the clock, their windows blacked out to avoid detection. Women melted down pots and pans for ammunition. Teenagers volunteered to dig anti-tank ditches along the outskirts. The city prepared to burn before it would surrender. And then, in December, as temperatures plunged below -30, the Red Army struck back. Siberian divisions, hardened by cold and trained in snow warfare, counterattacked. German units, exhausted and frostbitten, began to crumble. For the first time, the Wehrmacht was forced to retreat. The battle for Moscow was not just a military turning point, it was a psychological one. The myth of German invincibility was broken, but the cost was catastrophic. Entire Soviet villages had ceased to exist. Whole families perished in frozen ruins. For every German soldier killed, 5 Soviet civilians died in the crossfire. When spring finally came, it revealed a landscape of devastation. Fields sown not with crops, but with bones. As the war dragged on, the Eastern Front became a graveyard of nations. Stalingrad, Kursk, Leningrad. Each name would enter history as a monument to endurance and suffering. The siege of Leningrad lasted 872 days. Nearly 1 million civilians starved within the city's frozen walls. Mothers boiled wallpaper for food. Children scrawled diary entries that would later become silent witnesses to the unimaginable. "I am alone," one wrote. "Everyone has died." And yet through it all, messages continued to travel. Secret radio waves bouncing between forests and ruins. In Warsaw, a small cell of operators known as the Echo Group managed to intercept German communications revealing the early structure of concentration camps in occupied Poland. Their coded reports reached London in 1942, warning of systematic extermination. Few believed them at first. The scale of the horror defied comprehension. By 1943, the tide had begun to turn. German casualties mounted, and the Red Army's resilience became unstoppable. Soviet T-34 tanks roared westward, reclaiming burned towns one by one. But victory came with vengeance. Partisan units hunted collaborators. Civilians caught between fronts suffered again, first under German rule, then under Soviet liberation. For many, freedom and terror became indistinguishable. The sounds of that front still haunt the archives. Cracked recordings capture the echo of artillery across snowfields, the low hum of Morse code under static, the sudden silence after a transmission cuts off. They remind us that the war was not fought only by generals and statesmen, but by voices, brief, fragile, human, calling out into the noise of history. As 1944 approached, the Red Army pushed west into lands once Polish, now scarred beyond recognition. Forests were blackened, rivers clogged with debris. German forces began their retreat, leaving nothing but ruin behind. And amid that ruin, a small detachment of Soviet radio operators discovered something strange. A hidden transmitter buried beneath collapsed timber in the forest. Its call sign was old, its code unfamiliar. The signal it once carried matched fragments from that same faint Polish broadcast years before. A message lost, now found again. It was only a single line, barely legible after years of decay. We are still here. The fire in the east had burned cities, empires, and millions of lives to ashes. But through that inferno, the faint voices of the forgotten still whispered, proof that even in war's darkest hours, truth and defiance refuse to die. Chapter 4: The Ashes and the Silence. By 1945, Europe was no longer a continent, it was a wound. Entire nations lay in ruins. Cities that once glowed with culture and life had become grey deserts of concrete and ash. Berlin, Warsaw, Dresden, names that now carried the smell of smoke and dust. For those who survived, the war did not end with victory. It ended with emptiness. In the east, Soviet soldiers marched westward through devastation they had helped to cause. Liberation came with vengeance. In towns once occupied by the Wehrmacht, families returned to find only foundations and photographs buried in mud. The front lines had passed, but the dead remained, frozen in trenches, lost in mass graves, or unmarked beneath collapsed buildings. Everywhere, people dug. They searched for sons, for daughters, for names. Sometimes they found bones, sometimes nothing at all. Warsaw was among the first cities to show both destruction and defiance. After the failed uprising of 1944, German forces had leveled it almost completely. When the Red Army entered the ruins months later, they found a city of ghosts, charred walls, scattered papers, and silence. Yet even there, life began to stir again. Survivors emerged from cellars and forest hideouts. A nurse set up a clinic in the remains of a church. A group of students began collecting what little documentation survived. Diaries, photographs, fragments of coded transmissions. They believed that even if no one listened now, the truth had to be preserved. Across Europe, that same impulse appeared like a heartbeat. In France, survivors of the resistance recorded testimonies on wax cylinders. In Germany, Allied investigators catalogued evidence of camps whose existence the world had refused to believe. American and British troops filmed what they saw in places like Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen. Skeletal prisoners, silent and staring into the camera lens, too weak to speak. When the reels reached London and Washington, even hardened generals wept. "We must not let this be forgotten," General Eisenhower said. "Someday someone will say this never happened." The human cost of the war defied numbers. 20 million in the Soviet Union, 6 million Jews across Europe, countless civilians, Roma, Poles, Ukrainians, disabled political dissidents, exterminated by policy, by hunger, by fire. Yet beyond those numbers were moments of staggering grace. A Polish farmer who hid children beneath his floorboards, a German nurse who smuggled medicine into ghettos, Soviet soldiers sharing bread with the same villagers their army had once conquered. The war had revealed humanity's darkest capacity, but also its faintest, most stubborn light. When the fighting stopped in May 1945, the silence felt unreal. The guns quieted, but the memories did not. The victors met in Yalta and Potsdam to redraw the map. Borders shifted again. Poland moved west. Germany split in two. The Iron Curtain descended. Not with noise, but with paperwork, checkpoints, and mistrust. The world entered a new kind of war. One fought in shadows and secrets instead of trenches. For the ordinary survivors, though, the struggle was simpler: to live again. A teacher in Krakow reopened her classroom with only half her students. A violinist returned to the Warsaw Philharmonic to play before an audience of soldiers and orphans. In Berlin, a widow swept rubble from her doorway every morning, as if clearing the past one stone at a time. These were small acts, quiet ones, but they mattered. In the following years, the ruins began to rebuild, brick by brick, street by street. Europe tried to find itself again, but beneath every foundation lay remnants of the war: shell casings, bones, burned books, and memories no one could quite bury. The new governments promised reconstruction. They spoke of progress, unity, and peace. Yet across the continent, another silence settled. The silence of what could not be spoken. Collaboration, revenge, survival. These words remained locked in hearts, sealed in official archives or erased entirely. In the Soviet zone, history itself was rewritten. Documents disappeared. Witnesses were reclassified as enemies of the people. Files on partisan units were sealed under military code, their radio transmissions labeled subversive. The faint Polish signal recorded years before was filed away among thousands of unmarked reels, forgotten as new conflicts took shape: the nuclear race, espionage, the Cold War. But for those who had lived through it, the past never faded. A former partisan, now an old man, wrote in his journal, "We won nothing, we survived. That is all." He buried the notebook under a birch tree outside his village, afraid even decades later to let his words be known. It would be found in 1991, after the fall of the Soviet Union, its pages damp but legible. By the time Europe began to heal, entire generations had grown up in the shadow of the war. They spoke of it as history, not memory. Museums replaced ruins. Monuments rose where bodies had once lain. Yet for those who still remembered the smell of burning fields, the sound of boots on cobblestones, the static of a secret radio broadcast, it was never over. The war had ended, but the silence it left behind had only just begun. That silence carried across oceans, into new wars and new fears. The atomic age had arrived. The same scientists who once built rockets for Hitler now worked for Washington. Former allies eyed each other through crosshairs and spy cameras. And through it all, history waited, patient, buried, whispering through the cracks of time. In the ashes of that silence, a truth endured. It was not found in treaties or speeches, but in the quiet resolve of people who remembered what they had seen. People who rebuilt not out of pride, but out of defiance. People who, when asked why they stayed, simply said, because someone had to tell the story. And though decades would pass before the world uncovered the last of their hidden words and secret broadcasts, the echo of their defiance never faded. It lingered in archives, in ruins, and in the hearts of those who refused to forget. For them, history was not over. It was still being written, one uncovered truth at a time. Chapter 5: Echoes of Memory. The war ended, but its sound never truly stopped. It changed form. It softened, faded, and slipped into the quiet spaces of memory, but it never disappeared. For decades, Europe rebuilt upon a foundation of buried secrets and unfinished stories. Governments shifted, alliances hardened, and a new kind of tension filled the air. It was no longer the roar of artillery. It was the whisper of wires, the hum of surveillance, the language of silence that defined the Cold War. By the 1950s, the continent had split in two. On one side stood the Western democracies, rebuilt under the promise of freedom. On the other, the Soviet bloc, where victory had turned into control. The Red Army that had once liberated Poland now stationed itself there as an occupying force. Soviet officers took over the same bunkers the Germans had used. The underground networks of resistance either vanished or went deeper into hiding. Those who had fought for independence found themselves labeled as nationalists, dissidents, even traitors. And yet, scattered across Eastern Europe, small groups continued to preserve what the war had almost erased. Historians who worked by candlelight, priests who hid diaries inside church walls, families who refused to destroy photographs even when the police demanded it. They were not heroes in the grand sense, just people who understood that truth once lost is almost impossible to recover. The faint radio transmissions from wartime Poland, the ones thought to be long gone, were rediscovered in the 1960s by Soviet archivists cataloguing captured German records. Most of them were dismissed as unverified civilian chatter. But one archivist, a woman named Ludmila Kovalenko, kept listening. She noticed patterns, repeated call signs, dates matching known German operations. She copied them in secret, storing them on a single reel she hid in her desk. She could have destroyed it. Instead, she saved it, for reasons even she couldn't fully explain. It sounded like they were still speaking to us, she wrote in a note decades later. I couldn't silence them. By the 1970s, Europe had become quieter still. The ruins were rebuilt, but the past remained just beneath the surface. The Soviet Union celebrated its Great Patriotic War as a story of triumph, not tragedy. Western nations told their own versions, cleaner, simpler, easier to bear. But in forgotten forests and old warehouses, the artifacts of truth waited. Each generation found them anew. A box of film reels, a notebook written in code, a radio signal recorded on decaying tape. Each discovery chipped away at the myths built to protect nations from remembering what they had done. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, those walls of secrecy began to crack too. Archives opened, files stamped classified for half a century were suddenly read by the grandchildren of those they condemned. In Poland, researchers uncovered the existence of Soviet listening stations that had monitored civilian frequencies long after the war. In one of those stations, beneath the dust of forgotten equipment, engineers found a rusted reel labeled simply 1944, Grodno Sector. It was the same recording Ludmila had once saved. The same voice, barely audible through static. "We are still here." The voice of a woman speaking in Polish, her tone calm even as gunfire crackled in the background. No name, no rank, just endurance. Modern experts restored the audio. The voice now plays in museums and documentaries across Europe. Visitors describe it as haunting because it sounds less like a message from the past and more like a reminder to the present. A call to remember, to listen, to never let silence rewrite what happened. Today, historians still uncover fragments of that world. In archives in Moscow, Berlin, London. In letters passed down through families. In recordings once thought to be meaningless static. Each piece reshapes what we thought we knew about the war. Not just who fought and who won, but who survived, who spoke, and who refused to be erased. And for the generation that lived through it, those memories never needed archives to exist. They lived in gestures, the pause before lighting a cigarette, the way a veteran's eyes drifted at the sound of thunder, the careful silence between words. Time has thinned their ranks but not their presence. Even as the last survivors fade, their echoes remain in their children and grandchildren, in the stories retold at dinner tables, in the names etched on gravestones, in the quiet resilience of those who came after. History, in the end, is not just about dates and battles. It's about the persistence of memory, the decision to keep listening to voices that were almost lost. The rediscovery of a signal once buried beneath static is not just a historical curiosity. It is a metaphor for every truth humanity tries to hide. Because every lie, every cover-up, every silence eventually meets its echo. The war began with noise, marching boots, speeches, bombs, but it ends here with a whisper. A voice carried across time, faint but unbroken. We are still here, and they are. In every document restored, every witness remembered, every truth finally told. The echo of their courage still travels through history's static, reminding us that the past does not stay buried forever. It only waits for someone to listen,